Today we conclude a short series, sort of a mini-series, a Netflix limited series on common sayings that we have as people, but particularly as Christians, and exploring them to see whether they're really true or false. We've looked at the phrase, well, Christians are always happy. We also looked at the very common phrase, everything happens for a reason. And we learned that, as we explored them, both statements are generally misused, and they can convey false ideas about God and even false ideas about those of us who follow Christ. Today we're going to look at another common phrase, which is God helps those who help themselves. Probably most of us have used it, and all of us have heard it somewhere along the way. We may be surprised that this verse is not in the Bible. I thought I knew exactly where it was. I thought I had it underlined and highlighted, and I couldn't find it, and I realized it's not in the Bible. It's not in Proverbs, it's not spoken by the prophets, it's not a teaching of Jesus, it's not in the writings of Paul, it is just not in the Bible. But just because it's not in the Bible doesn't mean that it's false. God helps those who help themselves. It isn't so much what it says, it's sort of what it implies and when it is applied. For instance, a high school senior comes home with his report card, and he's really discouraged, upset, angry, frustrated, because he knows that he has studied hard and he has prayed hard. And he says to his mom, look at this. I got B's and C's and just a few A's. If I don't get good grades, I can't get into a good college. And if I don't get into a good college, I can't get into medical school. And if I can't get into medical school, I can't become a doctor. And I know this is what I am called to be, discouraged and ready to give up. And his mother says to him, remember, son, God helps those who help themselves. It's the implication and the application. An elderly man has a stroke, and he works hard for months in physical therapy. The first several months, he made really rapid progress. But in this last month, he has shown very little improvement. He's feeling discouraged and frankly a little frightened because he thinks, do I have to live the rest of my life with the abilities or disabilities that I have right now? His son visits with him and listens to his father's discouragement, and he says, remember, Dad, God helps those who help themselves. Implication and application. The problem with this statement isn't not so much what it says, but it's what it implies. It implies that God only helps those who help themselves. That if we do not do our part, then God will not do God's part. And if we do not help ourselves, then God's not going to help us. The problem with this statement is not what it says, but when it is applied. For instance, maybe if you had just tried a little harder, God could have done more, right? Maybe you didn't believe enough or pray enough or go to church often enough. We've all felt that way. When things didn't go our way, we thought maybe it's because we just didn't pray hard enough. Maybe that miracle didn't happen because it's something that we failed to do. Maybe your heart isn't pure enough. Maybe you just didn't do enough. But when we do that, it's works righteousness. It's as if somehow we can earn God's help. When applied, it inflicts guilt and shame on the person. But worse than that, when it's applied, it also puts conditions on God's love. And there aren't any conditions on God's love. As humans, we tend to think in terms of contracts. I mean, contracts are important. They help particularly our economy, but they help to keep our culture going. And they've been around for a long time. A contract says, if you do thus and such, then I will do thus and so. However, if you fail to do thus and such, then I don't have to do thus and so. It's a contract. And we have them with banks and credit card companies and insurance companies and employees and employers and with the government and with our neighbors and even with our family and friends. But what we have with God is not a contract. What we have with God is a covenant. We are in covenant with God. It's a term that's oftentimes used in Christian liturgy, especially during communion. We use the word covenant. The primary book of our faith, of course, is the Bible, and it's divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. The word testament means covenant. It's divided into the Old Covenant with Abraham and Sarah and the New Covenant made in Christ Jesus. The primary difference between a contract and a covenant is this one tiny word, the word if, I-F. There is an if in contract. If you do thus and such, then I will do thus and so. It's a contract. But there is no if in a covenant. God says, you love each other, you love me, and I love you. Notice there's no ifs. There's a whole string of ands. You love each other, and you love me, and I love you. And you can put those ands together, and you can put them in whatever order you want. One is not contingent upon the other. It's not if you love me and love each other, then I will love you. That's not what God says, because God's love is unconditional. It's not a contract. It is a covenant. Romans 5:8 that was just read a few minutes ago said that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were yet sinners. It's not while we were repenting or because we had come to the end of our own rope or because we had already helped ourselves, but while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Some translations put it this way, while we were helpless or while we were weak. Helpless, unable to help ourselves. This is the nature of God's love. Because almost anybody can love by appointment. It's sort of, take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning if you still need me. Help yourself first, and then if that doesn't work, then call me. And that's sort of the way that humans generally work. That's how we relate to each other. But that's not how God relates to us. Listen to how God relates to us. Lazarus had been dead for 3 days. Dead. He could do nothing to help himself. No one could do anything to help Lazarus because he was helpless. They were helpless. But Jesus came and raised him to new life. Jairus wasn't even a follower of Jesus, but his daughter was dying and no one else could help her. He was helpless, Jairus was. His little girl was helpless. In fact, she was dead by the time Jesus got to their home. It was in their helplessness that Jesus raised her to life. The miracles of Jesus were performed to help the helpless. The paralytic couldn't even get to Jesus. His friends had to carry him there. The woman with the flow of blood for 12 years that Pastor Jan preached on had gotten no help from the doctors. The man at the pool of Siloam was sick for 38 years, and no one helped him reach into the healing waters. The thief on the cross could do nothing to help himself. His crime had nailed him to the tree of death. But Jesus came and brought him eternal life that very day. All of these people were helpless. Christ helps the helpless. The whole idea of helping those who do not help themselves, think about this, feels really wrong to us. It feels so, codependent or perpetuating irresponsible behavior, helping those who do not help themselves. It's contrary to all parenting skills and such that we have been taught. But God is not in a codependent relationship with us or with anything in creation. God is never dependent upon us to be God. However, we are completely and utterly dependent upon God in order to have abundant life. There is nothing codependent about that. God is not some kind of government agency dispensing help to the deserving poor. But rather, God is not our earthly parent, but our God, the one who is the Almighty, the one who is omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent and infinite and immutable. That's our God. In Psalm 103, verse 10, it says, God does not deal with us according to our sins, God does not requite us according to our iniquities. God is in the business of help that is based on need and not on merit. God helps us because of our need, not because we deserve it. Most of us are familiar with a 12-step program like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's helped millions of people over the years. It has 12 steps, but it begins with these 3. The first one, I am powerless over alcohol, and my life has become unmanageable. I am powerless is the way it starts. Well, according to the false assumption that God helps those who help themselves, the next step would be, I just need to try harder not to be so powerless and to make my life a little bit more manageable. But that is not the second step. The second step is, I came to believe that a power greater than me could restore me to sanity. I came to believe that a power greater than me could restore me to sanity. And the third follows, and so I made the decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. So the only action needed is surrender. The only action needed is to recognize that we are helpless. Not to try harder and harder and harder, but simply to let go and let God. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, God's power is made perfect in our weakness. That is so powerful. I one time stitched that and had it framed. God's power is made perfect in our weakness. I needed to remind myself that it wasn't about doing more and doing more and doing more, but it was allowing myself to be just who I am and for God's power to work through that. God comes when we need it, not when we deserve it. God comes to us and helps us at our place of need, not because we in any way have earned it. One of my favorite sayings that I've said for many, many years is this: work as if everything depends upon you. Pray as if everything depends upon God. And that combination of work and prayer seems to work. Sometimes they're not equal at all. Sometimes it seems like we're doing a lot more working than we are praying, and other times we're doing very little but praying. But work as if everything depends upon you, and pray as if everything depends upon God. I want to close the message this morning with a personal story, and if you've been here 2 weeks, while I've been here, you know that I like to tell personal stories. Even my grandchildren will say, Grandma, don't read us a book. Tell us a story about your life. So you're going to get one of those stories today. In 2021, I contracted COVID. It was just after the shots had come out, and I was on the list, but I hadn't yet been called in to get one. So I didn't have any of the medication. And I just kept getting sicker and sicker each day. And my husband was trying to figure out what he should do. But medical advice was frankly hard to come by. You may remember during that time that the medical professionals were overwhelmed and they were floundering. He hesitated taking me to the hospital because so many people went and never came home. So after about a week at home with COVID, he wisely took me to the hospital. Later, I posted this on Facebook, and I went back and reread it and wanted to read it to you this morning. It was about 3 weeks after I'd first been diagnosed. The post says, last week I was trying to negotiate my release from Chippenham Hospital. I'd gone in on the 5th of March with COVID double pneumonia. I was too sick to know just how sick I was. I do remember not knowing my name for most of the 10 days I was in the hospital. My oxygen levels were very low. I'd forgotten even how to speak. At some point, various people told me my oxygen levels, but when you don't know your name or how to talk, oxygen levels aren't likely to take up much gray matter. As far as I know, I was never in pain, and I had so little awareness that I didn't know to be concerned about me or my health or my family, really nothing. Actually, it's not a bad place to be. I continued, I'm beginning to put some of the pieces together as Bob tells me some of what happened. But this morning, as I write this, I am just thankful. I feel a sense of free-falling grace. I had no awareness, let alone control of my situation. I didn't even know to pray. I was just existing in this free space. The doctors were treating me with what they thought was the best treatment and waiting for my body to respond. Everyone was waiting. Bob tells me he was in some communication with the hospital about me and my condition. Remember that time there weren't any visitors allowed in the hospitals? All the while, he was checking his own health to be sure he hadn't contracted COVID. He worked with our 2 children to develop a plan to communicate with family and friends and medical people at the hospital. Bob was quarantined, so our son brought groceries to him. Our daughter, who lived out of state, managed my calendar, which was full of commitments, and responded to people's inquiries on Facebook. And like they always have, they worked as a team. But I was aware of none of this. Eventually, I saw that my older grandkids had made some big posters and sent flowers. I remember the nurses taping the posters to the windows in my hospital room. Later, I learned that people all across this country and in South Sudan were praying for me. But I had no awareness of any of this. I couldn't manage the phone or the remote control for the TV. My brain just didn't compute any of that. But if a nurse happened to be in a room when the phone rang, I tried to have a conversation, but again, was unable to make words thought into words spoken. My family was wondering if I did survive this, what I would be like. But I had no awareness of any of this, just free falling grace. I ended this way. I have nothing profound to write this morning, still way too much brain fog. But I couldn't sleep until I wrote something. Thanks to all of you for your thoughts, prayers, food, cards, phone calls, etc. to me and my family. I would like to say that I felt them, but the majority of days in the hospital, I was just trying to breathe. I truly was in this free space. I think they call it grace. I think I'll stay a bit longer. It's a good place to be. End of the post. Eventually, I did get my strength back. I lost my hair. It came back in curly, and then it grew out straight. I received cognitive therapy. Did you know there was such a thing? And that therapy and time restored most of my cognitive ability. Now, how much it restored, it probably depends on how you read me. But the doctor said that my recovery was remarkable. Paul wrote, "While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for us, for the ungodly." God shows God's love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It is false by implication and application to say that God helps those who help themselves. It is true in every way to say God does not deal with us according to our iniquities, but rather while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Christ's power is made perfect in our weakness. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.